should be sent to hell. You rotten motherfuckers. You bastards. I'm a bastard. You should be sent to hell.
It turns out that drinking fascist tears is as stupid and as pointless a proposition as enjoying the taste of liberal tears, so we can park that immediately. Some schadenfreude are attached to the cessation of America's flirtation with fascism yesterday, but oddly, watching Joe Biden's speech, the thing I felt most keenly was actually fear. Because, my God, we came so close. I say we, loosely. I don't actually think it's entirely fair of Donald Trump to have described Boris Johnson as Britain Trump, although, of course, he did. But it was watching Biden describe humanity that moved me most. And the reason I use the word fear is because he confirmed, didn't he, that all of our concerns were quite genuine. How many times over the last 4 years have we talked about the flesh-coloured body stocking? How many times have we wondered whether actually there might be something wrong with our eyesight and what we're seeing in front of us is not what it appears to be? How many times have we been tempted to ignore the evidence of our eyes and ears and not rise up against what was coalescing, what was coming into focus before us? It was quite incredible, actually, to reflect upon how quickly the scales have fallen from so many eyes. I am going to enjoy, what's the word I want? I am going to enjoy identifying the Pontius Pilates of our age. I don't know whether that makes me guilty of schadenfreude on an unacceptable level, but my goodness me, if the threat is fascism, if the threat is totalitarianism, if the threat is white supremacism, then it seems to me that there are no weapons too potent to deploy in the hope of making sure that the tides don't lap quite as high up against Western society as they did with Donald Trump. So what am I talking about? Good question. I'm talking about the fact that over the last 4 years, so many people have looked at what Donald Trump was doing to America and feared the worst, and then, in the words of that classic Sinclair Lewis novel, and then concluded that it couldn't happen here. And then you heard him talk about people who tell lies for money and power. You heard him talk about racial equality. You heard him... he actually name-checked, essentially, white supremacism, I think. Forgive me, I can't remember whether he actually said the words or not, but he was clearly describing the phenomenon. And I don't know about you, but I hadn't realised how much tension I was carrying. Partly, obviously, because America is supposed to be the land of the free, but also obviously because a certain strand of British politics and certainly British media was so inextricably intertwined with Donald Trump that you had to sort of wonder whether or not you were the one that was exaggerating. If you have to share office space with people that cheerlead for a man who is about as close as the free world has ever come to a full-on fascist, you do begin to wonder whether actually you're the one with the problem. You sit there and think, well, no, hang on, maybe he's not as bad as I think he is, because, well, you know, Chomo over there is taken the knee in front of him, or Chomo over there is going on about how it's great that he sticks it to the woke. Maybe he's not as bad as he seems to be. But then you see the man who was vice president and is now president describing in the most clear of terms precisely what Donald Trump represented. And there is that curious mixture of fear and relief. So, relief that he's gone, fear that you were right all along and he was every bit as bad as even his harshest critics attested. I mean, genuinely history-making for the right reasons, in the same way that the inauguration 4 years ago was history-making for the wrong reasons. It is... what's the word that you want? I mean... what I'd really like to do is talk to people who fell for it, actually. I mean, I appreciate... I'd like to talk to people who still think it wasn't a white supremacist project, who still think it wasn't neo-fascism at its boldest and baldest. I'd love to know what it is you think he offered that wasn't simply gross. The Muslim ban, the ban on people from majority Muslim countries. It's a fascinating thing, that, because it was an outrage that was subsumed by the next outrage. You even forget the chronology, don't you? You forget the passage of time. You forget what came first. So did the disgust and the outrage we should have felt at Americans with a Middle Eastern heritage being effectively banned indefinitely from seeing their own families, did that outrage begin to dissipate slightly or dilute slightly if you weren't directly affected before or after he started putting children in cages or separating families and leaving children? The last time we checked, over 600 children. We should check again, actually. I'm sure that number's come down a bit. I pray it has. What got rid of the outrage at the last issue? Answer, outrage at the latest issue. And don't forget, the reason fear was part of what I felt yesterday watching proceedings at the Capitol was because there was absolutely no guarantee that Biden was going to win. If Trump had won, and I still think that without the coronavirus he might have done, you'd have had at least another 4 years of this evil and possibly, generations of it. It is absolutely breathtaking how close we came to the sort of country, I'm talking about America, but I'm afraid however much they may try to wash their hands, you and I could probably make a fair stab at naming people from the right wing of British politics and the right wing of the British media who weren't just closing their eyes to Trump's depravity. They were cheering it along. They were loving it. They were absolutely loving it. And that fear of how close we came to the kind of country that I thought we'd only ever read about in history books. You sort of forget about Franco and to a lesser extent, no, not Tito, that wouldn't be fair, but you forget about the military coup in Greece. European countries, post-Tito Yugoslavia, you look at just how much how close to the edge societies and civilizations always are. You know what the Romans used to say, bread and circuses will keep the plebs distracted, and if their bellies are full and they've got something to cheer and laugh at, then they will be quite a pliant population. But when politics becomes the circus, things get incredibly, incredibly ugly, incredibly dangerous. So I don't know quite what question to ask you this morning. And obviously we're not going to be talking about American politics anything like as much in the coming 4 years as we were in the last 4 years, unless Joe Biden turns out to be a fascist in disguise and poses a grave threat to the Western world in the way that Donald Trump did, to basic freedoms, to liberty, decency, and liberalism, of course. But I think today we probably need to have a little look in the rearview mirror rather than at the road ahead. And it was Biden's speech, even more so than the insurrection on the Capitol, the white nationalist attack upon the seat of the cradle of American democracy, the bloke in the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt marching up the steps. Now, you know and I know that he is the sort of T-shirted equivalent of people that were writing editorials for prominent and prestigious British publications right up until a fortnight ago. It's quite incredible for me to see with absolute clarity, just how horrible Donald Trump and his regime were, and just how many people loved it. That's the weird thing. How many times have I asked you, what do you get in return for cheering Donald Trump? And you've tried to tell me it's something other than the validation of your racism. Some poor fella tried yesterday, as you may have heard. And when asked, what is it he does that is attractive or compelling or seductive that doesn't involve racism, there is no answer. There never was. It's quite incredible to see it now so clearly, because I have a theory, all right? Yeah, and I know, as Sam points out, the UK is still very much in trouble. So is America. Look, Joe Biden's not perfect. This is the point about my footballification theory. Just because Donald Trump was evil incarnate does not mean that Joe Biden is the Messiah. He's a flawed politician. He's got problems on his record. He's not a racist liar. So we'll take that as a win. Yeah? Yeah. Unless, of course, you like being lied to by racists, in which case presumably you're licking your wounds a bit this morning and getting ready to start protesting about non-existent threats to statues, for example, to make yourself feel better, or write letters to ITV about a dance troupe, or what else is on your list at the moment? Woke pretty much emerging in the course of Joe Biden's speech yesterday as just a synonym for anti-racist. So that's going to be an interesting evolution to see whether that word now goes the way of political correctness, and you'll have to come up with another word to describe anti-racism. But what's the question today for you? You're welcome to make your own suggestions. 84850 is the number you need to drop me a text, or you can tweet at Mr. James OB. But I suppose, here's my theory, right? And then we can examine that. You can use me as the punch bag stroke lens through which to examine this story. The really, really bad stuff happens when some of the good people convince themselves that it's not happening. Discuss. So there have been times over the last few years, partly perhaps because of where I work, when I've looked at Donald Trump and thought, well, maybe he's not actually. Maybe I'm the one that's getting a bit, what do they call it, Trump derangement syndrome. And then he literally incites his followers to attack the Capitol, poses a mortal threat to his own Vice President Mike Pence, refuses to acknowledge the result of an election, and in the final act of weapons-grade petulance, refuses even to attend the inauguration of his successor. So the last 2 weeks have seen a crystallization, a complete crystallization of the very worst fears of people like me, and people like you as well. But what have we learned? There you go. Almost exactly 15 minutes after I started talking, I got to the question that I want you to answer today. What have we learned? So I'll start. I have learned that fascism prevails when anti-fascists persuade themselves that what's happening in their own country isn't actually fascism after all, because, this isn't 1930s Germany, this is 21st century America, 21st century Britain. So what have you learned? I have learned that actually courage sometimes involves calling it out and not trying to convince yourself that things aren't as bad as they appear to be at first glance. Does that make sense? I think it does. I hope it does. If it doesn't, that's my fault. So what have you learned? 0345 6060 973. As Donald Trump heads off into the oblivion he so richly deserves, about $1 billion of debt about to be called in, myriad legal cases about to be brought. Goodness only knows what's going to happen to him next. People talk about his legacy. His legacy is clear. Fascism can happen here. That's the legacy, right there. And people that hate fascism, to give it a 21st century flavour, are currently called woke. So those are the two takeaways. That's Donald Trump's legacy. What have you learned from the last 4 years? And did it, as it did for me, come into a previously unachievable focus while Joe Biden made his inauguration speech yesterday? What have you learned from the last 4 years? What have you learned from seeing the land of the free flirt with fascism and come vanishingly close to consummating the relationship? What have you learned from the events of the last 4 years, and what should we have learned? Rory suggests would be an even more pertinent question. I found this comment, or this part of Joe Biden's speech, for reasons that regular listeners to this programme will understand all too well. I found this particularly moving.
We face an attack on our democracy and on truth, a raging virus, growing inequity, the sting of systemic racism, a climate in crisis, America's role in the world. Any one of these would be enough to challenge us in profound ways. But the fact is, we face them all at once, presenting this nation with one of the gravest responsibilities we've had. Now we're going to be tested. Are we going to step up?
An attack on truth. How many times have we talked about that? An attack on objective truth. Trace it back, to Kellyanne Conway? describing alternative facts as a euphemism for lies, trace it back to the claim that it didn't rain on Inauguration Day, the lies about the crowds. I mean, it is absolutely incredible. I should apologise. I didn't think this was going to be one of those days where I could quite happily rattle on until 1 o'clock without taking a single call. I promise you I'm going to take calls. But it's so bizarre. It's so bizarre. All the things that I've listed over the last 4 years, all the lies, all the corruption, all the depravity, always in the back of my mind, I realised yesterday, there's been a tiny voice going, yeah, all right, mate, are you sure about this? I mean, because, you know, there are people who do what you do for a living who seem to love it. People on telly and radio, writing newspaper columns all over the British media, people in Parliament, they seem to love this guy. If they love this guy and he is what you think he is, that's terrifying, right? And that's why yesterday's speech contained as much fear for me as it did relief. So what have you learned? 0345 6060 973. And let's be clear from the beginning that Joe Biden is neither a messiah nor a very naughty boy. Donald Trump's depravity is now beyond debate. Joe Biden is not the polar opposite of Donald Trump. He is a massive relief simply by dint of not being evil. But, you know, nobody who despises everything that Donald Trump represents becomes a slavish, sycophantic supporter of Joe Biden. That's not how it works. It works the other way round, of course. But it doesn't work like that. Because the most effective critics often, as Tobias Ellwood, actually, the Conservative MP, having a swing at ludicrous latest Brexity posturing from the Conservative government. Tobias Ellwood, by dint of being a Conservative backbencher, I think his criticism carries a lot more weight than actually criticism from the opposition benches does. But anyway, I digress unduly. David is in Gidea Park. David, what have we learned?
Okay, thanks for your for giving me time. Basically, I've learned that things will get much worse if Trumpism itself is not deleted. I believe that his lying is actually a virus that's worse and is designed to destroy democracy. I mean, that's become very clear. And the Senate must be prepared to deal with the cult of Trump problem and convict him. And if they don't do that, he's going to set up the Patriot Party.
I mean, this isn't quite... I'm not going to be too strict about it, but you're making a prediction about what the future might look like. It's not really something that you've... Well, it is in a sense something that you've learned from the past, but the speculation...
I predicted it.
Well, I think... I mean, predicted what?
I predicted it about a year before it happened. I said that you won't see the real Trump until the second term.
Well, you didn't predict it then, did you? Because we saw the real Trump before he even became president, mate.
But you didn't see anybody going to attack the Congress.
No, again, let's not get too bogged down in red herrings. You didn't predict an attack upon the Capitol in the final week of Trump's presidency.
Martial law.
Well, that didn't happen either, did it? So anyway, we'll crack on with the question of what have we learned. Jessica is in Teddington. Jessica, what would you like to say?
Hello. I think my learning's been a bit more general. It's really encouraged me to speak truth and speak out more about the things that are important, because if the big people in power aren't going to do it, it's up to us little guys.
Isn't that the Seamus Heaney? I think Seamus Heaney is Biden's favourite poet, and he has said, I can't remember whether he said it in speech or in a poem, that there is no such thing as an innocent bystander.
Yes. It's really interesting. So I'm actually interviewing someone today about a similar topic, but in a different industry.
Right.
And so I've been researching all those quotes. I think Einstein had another really good one around like witnessing evil and not saying anything.
But
evil.
Yes, and all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. But this is the bit.
Love that.
And I tell you what, Jessica, the luxury of discussing this, knowing that he's not in the White House, is one that I hadn't fully appreciated. I mean, it just feels so different, doesn't it? It's incredible. But evil is a big word. I've used it a lot, unapologetically, and in my opinion, obviously quite accurately. But if that other element,
I use it in inverted commas, because for me, the fast fashion industry is also evil. For me, McDonald's is evil, but I use it in inverted commas because for me, it's things that I don't agree with.
Yes.
I classify as
well,
evil.
no, I mean, the white supremacism and fascism are clearly evil on a slightly different scale. But what I'm drawn to is the question of there's a distinction between people who see evil and stay silent and people who don't see evil. And I caught myself, and I only really realised this yesterday. I think I've caught myself over the last 4 years trying to persuade myself that things aren't as bad as I initially thought that they were. And that's equally dangerous. In some ways, it's not morally worse than knowing it's evil and staying silent, but it's psychologically, I think, the reason why fascism succeeds. It's not because of the people that support it, and it's not stopped by the people that fight it. It comes about because of the people who persuade themselves that it's not as bad as it looks.
And I think the more though that those of us that do see the evil, be it in whatever area, on a bigger scale, on a smaller scale, the more that we can speak out about it, the more it's going to help those that do get swayed in, for want of a better phrase, a moment of weakness or whatever it may be. The more positivity that we can drop out there, the more truth that we can drop out there. I've learned, particularly through lockdown, the impact if I'm scrolling through Facebook, which I try not to do too much, and it's negative, this is horrible, that's horrible, and I see one nice comment about someone laughing about their dog doing something funny, that it can put me back in a, right, we're fighting for good, and I'm
Just
here.
a sort of like a little bit of an attitude adjustment moment. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. 03456060973. Good luck with the interview, Jessica, is the number that you need. Joe Biden, yes, here it is. It was Anthony who dropped this in. Joe Biden's favourite poet, Seamus Heaney, said there's no such thing as an innocent bystander. I don't know. Do we agree with that? Daniel in Chelsea says, genuinely what I've learned is that nuclear war is only an idiot away. I never thought that the world could so quickly become riled up in thoughtless comments by world leaders, i.e. North Korea and Iran. I believe the racists are currently contending that Trump didn't start any wars, which is evidence of what a good guy he is. Well, yeah, I mean, he may not have started any wars, but my goodness me, the arms sales to places like Saudi Arabia are not exactly the actions of a pacifist, shall we say. And what have I learned in the last 4 years? Accountability. Let me get this right. From John. Accountability, a topic for future discussion, perhaps. I'm wondering if the timing might be right for opening up a discussion about more accountability with politics, presidents and even prime ministers. 29 minutes after 10 is the time. Trump has gone. Ding dong. And Joe Biden is here. I mean, you say what you like about the man. He's not a fascist. And I would bet you £100 right now he will never encourage his Auschwitz T-shirt wearing supporters to attack the cradle of American democracy. So by any objective measure, unless you're a Nazi, this is a massive improvement on where America was a week ago. But I fully accept that, unless you're a Nazi. And, you know, who knew there were so many out there? So unless you're a Nazi, this is an objective improvement on where America was a week ago. What lessons have we learned? And it is a morning for relief, perhaps, and even some moderate celebration. But the problems, the seeds of division and hatred sown by Donald Trump and his supporters over the last 4 years will not disappear overnight. It will take generations. Indeed, a great phrase used by the Economist writer Jeremy Cliff, that the cordon sanitaire between what you might call mainstream conservatism and the far right, that the breakdown in those cordon sanitaire is not confined to America. The Swedish opposition leader has been making warm noises about their extremely right-wing party as well. And just have to look at Britain. How many Conservative backbenchers, I didn't actually count, but how many Conservative backbenchers were warm about Donald Trump? In I mean, at least one case I can remember from the last couple of weeks, actually boasting on their Twitter profile about how much they liked him. You've got the DUP being photographed with a big pro-Trump poster. You've got the leader of the House of Commons describing Donald Trump as being Britain's greatest ally after the Brexit, and saying that he'd vote for him until presumably he got his wrists slapped and had to withdraw that comment. So that's what I've learned. I've learned that it's not confined to history books, that, you know, it's the Anne Frank Trust annual lunch at 12 o'clock today. If you follow me on Twitter, you can sign up and attend it. I'd remind you that you can enjoy Mystery Hour on a podcast. But when I first got involved with the Anne Frank, and you should go and log on to the Anne Frank Trust annual lunch and make a donation, and then catch up with Mystery Hour later. Because when I first got involved with the work that they did, and they worked to battle bigotries, prejudices and hatreds of every kind, not just anti-Semitism, I even then, going back a few years, I thought it belonged to a different era. I've said to you before, I've used the word species, haven't I? I thought it would belong to a different species. And we're all, I think, susceptible to mythologizing our own experiences or oversimplifying our memories. But the world changed for me when I stood in the attic where the Frank family hid from the Nazis. And I'd read the diary as a kid. But again, it felt like a voice from a dim and distant past, despite being born in 1972, which is, 27 years after the war? I mean, that's incredible. If you're my age, the idea that the Second World War is a lot closer to your birth than you are now is almost impossible to process. But I stood in the attic where the Frank family lived, and it was a picture of her father. I'm going to lose it telling you this. It just, those moments in life that just shift everything inside you. It's a picture of Otto Frank returning after his family had been killed in the death camps. It was a picture of Otto Frank returning to the attic. Many years later, and I'd become a father myself at the time, and it just made me realise briefly, because the thought must have got buried again until Trump became president. It just made me think that this is not something that happened on a different planet. This was not something done by a different species. This was us. So what I've learned, or what I have been reminded of over the last 4 years, is that when forces of fascism or Nazism or evil or whatever you prefer to call them, the basic idea that you deserve to be punished because of your birth circumstances, or you deserve to be treated differently according to an accident of birth, whether it's geography or ethnicity, skin colour, or religion, actually. What I have been reminded of in the starkest of terms over the last 4 years is that this is not done by aliens who come marching into your town overnight. This is done by your own neighbours, your colleagues, your friends, your family members. That fascism is within us as a society at all times. And the intoxicating nature of that invitation is something that I had underestimated until Trump got into the White House. You just presume people would see through him like a cheap suit. But you have extremely prominent members of the British political establishment, extremely prominent members of the British media, all lining up to anoint him, to take the proverbial knee, to cheer him. Now, either they're stupid and they didn't realise what they were doing, which is a defence of sorts, the old ignorance defence, or they're not. They knew exactly what they were doing. They just loved what they saw. I'm not sure we'll ever know the difference. Who's ever going to put their hands up and admit? Everyone would claim, I had no idea. How could I possibly have known that a man that boasts about sexually assaulting women, mocks disabled journalists, insults military heroes, insults war veterans? How could I possibly have known that he was a wrong-un? Which means the only alternative, pretty much the alternative, is that you saw it and you liked it. So my big takeaway: could happen anywhere, including here. And if it did, there'd be people on the other side who used to be your friends, your colleagues, even your family members. Blimey, it's a cheering thought. 20 to 11 is the time. Martin is in Belfast, where some of these lessons probably resonate rather differently in Northern Ireland than they do in mainland Britain for historical and rather obvious reasons. Martin, what would you like to say?
Well, I actually go back to Munich in the 1930s when, Hitler was a fun character in the beer halls of Munich. After that initial putsch,
yes,
he actually went to prison. But it was only then that he really was starting. And, in America, it remains ripe for fascist takeover.
Well, it can't have disappeared overnight, that appetite and that
And really what Trump has done is shown how you galvanise that right wing. And while lots of them didn't agree with certain aspects of Trump, they all had their own agenda. And it was, if you look back to Germany, really Hitler finally got his hands on power by burning down the Reichstag. And I mean, really, 2 weeks ago, we came a box of matches away from the risk of the same thing happening. And the one thing I do think that Trump was different to someone like Hitler is he doesn't care about people. We know that through COVID. But he wasn't prepared to go as far as, for example, Hitler did with the SA, his jackboot sort of army that went around scaring people. But I suspect that if Trump had got back in, groups like the Proud Boys would have been encouraged more and more to become more active, to scare the middle class.
Stand by, he said, didn't he? Stand by. He told them to stand by.
He told them to stand by. But I suspect, and he came within, frighteningly close to winning a second term. In his second term, those people would have been better organised.
Oh, for sure.
And the fear is, James, that there are people, if not Trump himself, there are other people in his family or close to him who are looking at the lessons of what needs to be done for a right-wing takeover. And the broad political support is there, which it wasn't in Germany back in the 1930s, but they've built that part of it. But a more ruthless and less egotistical person, someone with more thought to what they can achieve as to what they can get for themselves.
Well, do you know, you're describing the difference between a sort of narcissistic sociopath and someone who may be possessed of similar traits but has a genuine ideology. I think if Trump thought it would have made him richer, he'd have come out as the godfather of liberalism and wokeism, whatever that's supposed to mean. If he thought that would have got him over the line, or that would have won him power, influence and ideally money, he'd have pretended to be, I don't know, Whoopi Goldberg. But it was just the opportunity. The planets aligned. His base racism was a huge help in being able to do this kind of thing. But the opportunism that runs through him is epic. And you're describing someone who was less opportunistic or less egotistical and more focused upon the prize, as it were.
But it just, Trump shows us that someone with that skill set, and there are plenty of them who will be.
Are there plenty with that skill set? Because
I think there were plenty. I think there are people who were close to Trump who will have learned that you need to have boots on the ground in a disciplined fashion, and Trump, I think, would have gone further himself.
Oh, of course. Well, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the reports that are coming out now of how he responded to the scenes of violence and his frustration with people who kept calling upon him to condemn them, and he couldn't understand why people weren't as excited by it as he was. There's no doubt about that. But you put me in an odd position because I don't think it is commonplace, that skill set. I think if you remember the role that the American dream plays in American society, the perception of Trump as a very successful businessman is absolutely intrinsic to his political success. A false perception, quite probably, but we don't get The Apprentice. I presume you don't watch the American version of The Apprentice. I know I don't.
No.
And that was a huge part of his political propulsion, because it cast him, it means he arrived on the political stage as someone pretending to reject the political establishment, but also as someone who embodied the American dream, the wealth, the epic wealth that he has, pretended to possess, gave him such a massive head start that I hope I'm right and you're wrong. I can't prove it, and it may well be that it's the other way around, but I think there is something unique about him and the planets that he aligned. Although, your warnings about the difference between the shift from becoming a figure of fun at the beer hall putsch to becoming the most evil dictator the Western world has ever seen is a very potent point. I just stress one other thing, if you're listening to Martin. The scenes at the Capitol 2 weeks ago were absolutely awful. This is the weird thing about being a liberal, is that when you get the proof that you're right, it upsets you even more than it upsets the people who told you were wrong. That's a really weird thing. So you see those scenes, they prove that you were right in all your warnings about Trump, all your fears about Trump. My God, he was even worse than that. But you don't get any pleasure whatsoever from seeing yourself being proved right, because you're being proved right by seeing a bloke in a Camp Auschwitz T-shirt launch a violent attack upon the cradle of American democracy. So don't, please, I'm sure you didn't, but just in case anybody made the mistake of thinking that you derive pleasure from being proved right, it's the polar opposite. Martin, thank you. A couple of phone lines free if you're quick. 0345 60 60973. What have you learnt from the last 4 years? For good or for ill, what has Donald Trump's presidency and the teetering upon the edge of catastrophe that we saw in the final days of his presidency, what has it taught you? What have you learned? And remember, however desperately you try and contort yourself into a position of supporting or defending Trump, he's still lying about the election result. I mean, the mother of all lies, really, in a liberal democracy. And the attempts by people, I guess we'd have to describe them as fascist sympathisers on this side of the Atlantic, to equate it to calls for a second referendum. I mean, that is an indication of just how desperate people who supported Trump's neo-fascism are to pretend that they're not guilty. Oh, yes, it's just like people that wanted a second referendum on European Union membership. Yeah, of course it is. For heaven's sake, I mean, if you bend yourself backwards so completely, I presume you end up walking around on your hands. What have we learned from Donald Trump's presidency? Well, not a lot of it good, I think it's fair to say, but almost certainly important. The other point, and I'm so sorry that I have to, it falls to me to make this point, but the state of the British media being what it is, I have to remind you that the people who looked at Donald Trump looked at his depravity and didn't vomit, metaphorically speaking. It didn't just fail to vomit, but actually applauded, cheered, defended, apologised, ignored, excused, exhorted. Those people, they're not going anywhere. They're still all over your newspapers, all over Parliament and all over your telly. So be careful. John's in Exeter. John, what would you like to say?
Good morning.
Hello.
You asked, or you stated that perhaps there were two questions. Either you didn't care or you were stupid. I think possibly there's a third, and that is looking at what is the alternative to Trump. So the alternative was Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton represented the well-heeled of America. And there's an awful lot of people who thought to themselves, well, I'm sorry, but she's not palatable either.
Yes. I mean,
so,
you're going back further than... I mean, this isn't something that you've learned from Donald Trump's presidency. This is something you learned from the media coverage of the last election, where Donald Trump's depravity was balanced out by some nonsense about Hillary Clinton's emails. So we learned something about the media, and in its attempts to be balanced, it ends up being the precise opposite if one of the people that they're trying to balance out is depraved. Because no one could claim Hillary Clinton was depraved.
No, they couldn't claim she was depraved, but if I have lost my job and the well-heeled on Capitol Hill are basically what I'm suggesting is, or I'm thinking is that the haves and the have-nots, I guess the gap is getting wider, and that's true here as well as probably in America. I don't know that. It's certainly true here. So the gap's getting wider, and so Hillary is representing, or whoever is representing...
portrayed as, I think, is fairer, because the idea that Donald Trump has the interests of poor people at his heart is about as close to bonkers as it's possible to imagine. So you portray Hillary Clinton as representing... well, it's projection, isn't it? You accuse Hillary Clinton of being all the things that you know you are. And it works, because the media is supine.
The media, of course, is that brings up another... Just to complete my point, you see, if we keep getting this gap getting wider, if the haves and the have-nots get wider, and I can't remember the exact percentages, you probably know off the top of your head, but it's something like 5% of the population in America own 90% of the wealth.
Off the top of my head, I think it's actually much worse than that. But you're right. The problem is Trump was lying when he claimed to care about those people.
But you see, if you don't call out if the press, if the media don't call out the lies,
precisely,
then or the untruths, or then, and there's probably very good reasons for it. There's a lovely story of a female journalist going with George W. Bush on his campaign trail.
Yeah.
Where basically all the journalists get on the plane, they fly from A to B, they get off at B, all go down the steps, take a photograph of Bush getting off the plane, go to a meeting, a press conference, they ask the questions, and they all get on the plane and fly to point C. And this female journalist, I can't remember her name, but she put her hand up, and Bush asked her, what's your question? She asked an awkward question that wasn't on the script.
Go on.
Bush then snubbed her. He never asked her another question. He scowled at her, the press secretary of Bush basically castigated her, and all the other journalists sent her to Coventry.
Yeah, I don't know this story, but you're dead right. And you saw it reach its apotheosis in the press briefings at the White House, where all I wanted to see, John, was that after he'd silenced one journalist or insulted one journalist or ignored one journalist, all we needed to see was the next journalist in line to stand up and ask the same question. Bizarrely,
Yes,
I feel the same about the coronavirus briefings, actually. And I don't know if you heard Gavin Williamson being interviewed this morning, but the gulf between the question he is asked and the answer he provides, it's like the Grand Canyon. If everyone who has the luxury of speaking to members of this government on a regular basis were to pool their resources and work out what the most important question is, today it was exams. What the hell is going to happen to our children's exams? And everyone just agrees to keep asking the most important question so that the filibustering falls apart. But hey-ho.
There's another very brief. There's another chapter, another paragraph to the story of this poor female journalist who asked the question, and all the other journalists then sent her to Coventry.
Yes.
About a period later, a week, 2 weeks later, a month later, whatever it was, Bush, who sits at the front of the plane, and she's sitting on her own in the plane, of course, because no one will get anywhere near her. Bush gets up, comes back down, and sits next to her. And suddenly they kiss and make up.
How funny.
And Bush, lovely little expression I always remember, Bush says to her as he gets up to go back to his seat, having kissed and made up, he said to her, "You need to spend more time at the back of the plane with the tequila drinkers."
As in, come on, be part of it, rather than on the outside holding it to account. It's yes. Yeah. I don't know that story. I've got no reason to doubt you, but the model you describe, the idea, and it is a scary thing. I'm to be self-referential for a change. I'm very lucky that I can do this job without needing politicians to come on to the programme. But in almost every other corner of the media, if they refuse to come on, and look at the way they treated the Susanna Reid show on ITV, where they stopped coming on for ages because her sidekick kept haranguing the politicians, quite rightly. They should be harangued, and Susanna's sidekick does a cracking job of haranguing politicians. Unfortunately, also one of the biggest cheerleaders for Donald Trump in the British media, but nobody's perfect. And if they don't come on, you don't have a show.
Yeah. I think John Humphreys, who used to do the Radio 4 thing, the Radio 4 morning programme. Blair, I understand, would never go on and be interviewed by him.
I don't know if that's true. Again, it's something that's worth checking, but I can tell you...
It's something that I understand, I've heard.
I can tell you that John Humphreys is currently doing a show on Classic FM, which I caught at the weekend, and it is absolutely brilliant. I fell out of love with John Humphreys as a journalist in the latter days of his career at Radio 4, but I stumbled across his Classic FM show at the weekend, and what a communicator. The warmth of his voice, the timbre of his voice, and his knowledge of the music that he's playing was there you go. We found something to celebrate in the course of these contemplations. It's coming up to 10:59. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of what we've learned... John makes a brilliant point, but actually I'm a bit embarrassed that we got through an hour of the programme without recognising what we've learned about the media. The media model is broken. What have we learned then from the last 4 years? And tomorrow, a lot of you getting a little impatient with me for the Brexit coverage that we're also going to have to provide moving forward. But at least we can leave Trump in the fridge for the time being. The failure of the media to deal with the threat, it makes it astonishing, really, to reflect upon the fact that in this country, it's a bunch of millionaires who think we need more right-wing TV channels. That's actually hilarious, isn't it? So you have a look at what just happened in America. Donald Trump without Fox News would be Donald Trump without underpants. Fox News and Donald Trump go together like a horse and carriage. And they look at that. They look at what happened. They look at the assault upon the cradle of American democracy, the violence, the mortal threat posed to the vice president by supporters of the president. And largely foreign millionaires, it's worth adding. I think New Zealanders and Rupert Murdoch look at the United Kingdom and think, I'll tell you what those guys really need. They need more right-wing pseudo-news channels. They need more right-wing talk shows. Wow. Because, my God, lefties like me have got the absolute monopoly on the airwaves. You can barely turn on the telly or the radio without hearing someone who's anti-Trump, anti-Brexit, anti-Johnson. It's ridiculous how I'm being sarcastic. You can probably only name 3, and only one of them's got a national radio show. It's hilarious. But that's what they think we need, lads. We need more right-wing talk shows. In fact, we need 2 new channels dedicated to slightly more right-wing, because we've got to do something about the BBC being largely accurate, haven't we? We've got to do something to inflate the notion that the BBC is biased. And 5 minutes after 11 is the time. I may remind you, if you're new to the programme, that the BBC is so biased that I had to resign from it in order to tell you the truth on this programme about Donald Trump and Brexit. So I'm feeling very silly now that both have gone so brilliantly well. What a foolish gesture that was. What have you learned? 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. And we're going to go on to Skype, actually, I think, where we have a call from Brunswick in New Jersey. Dan is there. Dan, what have you learned?
Hey, James.
Hey.
So I guess just the major thing is, or the most prominent is how many of my fellow citizens are just so gullible and the scale of it, and how successfully Trump has managed to just tap into that factor and exacerbate it all. How 74 million people preferred him to Biden. It's shocking and depressing.
Gullible is a generous analysis. I'd take no, I mean that. I know it sounds a bit cheeky, but I would rather they were gullible than the alternative, if you see what I mean.
I think it's definitely both. I've definitely spoken to people who are the alternative, and also other people who are just gullible and buy into the whole thing about how anything negative must be lies. Fake news.
Yeah.
And
that worked, and that was a very deliberate assault upon objective truth that began pretty much at the very beginning. I think I also, because I do this for a living, I have a slight tendency to presume that everybody else is paying as much attention as I am. And actually, if you were just sort of slightly drawn to the claim that he was going to bring jobs back, or that, Middle Eastern factories or China had assumed too much power, and you don't think too deeply about it, that is the gullible without being complicit in the really, really nasty stuff. But whether you could be completely unaware of the really nasty stuff is unlikely, but if they're telling you that the really nasty stuff is fake news, then that's an offer you'd take, wouldn't you, if you'd fallen for the first lot of nonsense?
Yeah, but then there's almost a point to where it's a willful decision to not just do your own research and try and figure out if he actually is saying all this nasty stuff, right?
Yeah.
You could easily look into it and figure out if.
Yeah, but this is what I mean by paying attention. Some people love the news. Some people are addicted to it. Some people, thrive on it. Other people would struggle to tell you who the Chancellor of the Exchequer was. They certainly wouldn't be able to tell you who the Secretary of State was last week or will be next week. So I'm not being... I hope I'm not being complacent, but of the 74 million people, there must be a significant number. Maybe I am falling into the trap I described earlier of trying to persuade myself things aren't as bad as they look. But if you could sit down with those 74 million people and just talk them through objective truth, I still have to believe that a significant proportion of them would abandon their support for Donald Trump. No?
Yeah, I'm a significant proportion for sure. I don't know what the number is, but that is what gives me hope. But on the other hand, they've had 4 years, and even after the COVID response, the things that he's reportedly said about the military, they've still decided to not change their mind.
What would you offer up as the biggest explanation / excuse for that? I waxed lyrical about my own theories. I'd like to hear yours. What did they get from him, or what did they think they were going to get from him that could have explained the closing of the eyes to the coronavirus response, or the abuse of soldiers? Or we could sit here all day. What do you think they felt was on the other side of the scales, weighing so heavily that it outbalanced all of the depravities that we described?
There's so many things. I've used the term footballification. If I understand what you mean by that, it's that they've turned their side of politics into what's effectively their sports team.
Yes.
Right. So even if their favorite player does something heinous and disgusting, it's easy to just dismiss it because he's good for the team.
Yes.
I think that's a huge part. I think that a lot of these people, have made any kind of left-wing political thought in America into their own personal evil.
And if you ask them what left-wing means, they generally don't know.
It's communism is the same as socialism, is the same as democratic socialism. They have no concept.
And in fact, is the same as Christianity. In many ways, you know, the do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, the love thy neighbour, all of the doctrines about the you know, what you should do with the poor. That's the real disconnect with the evangelical movement. Is that well, anyway, we're over analysing or over complicating things. Are you hopeful? Do you think that the forces of Trumpian fascism are in abeyance, or do you think they're just on holiday for a while?
It remains to be seen. I am hopeful that this might be the end of it. In particular, I mean, I think that the best chance we have of that is a fracturing of the Republican Party.
Yes.
As a whole. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Alex Jones.
Yeah, well, yeah. But again, he's a perfect example, isn't he, of somebody who went in the course of a decade from being an absolute joke, worse than a joke, when he started accusing the Sandy Hook families of being actors and hoaxers, and then he arrived. I mean, Trump gave him interviews. He even at one point was interviewed by someone who worked here, although not on this radio station. I mean, that journey I can't get my head around, Dan. Actually, how did he ever end up in the mainstream, as it were?
I mean, that's there's a lot of factors. I think, you know, the Facebook and YouTube and the algorithms that propagate, you know, you might like this because you just watched this. I think that had a huge factor. But I was going to say the reason I'm somewhat hopeful is that, so now he's fighting with or disavowing the QAnon movement. So there's a fracture there. And it seems that both QAnon and Alex Jones fans are disavowing the mainstream Republican Party. So
we're going to see how it's made up, what the Russian doll is really like when the dolls all go their separate ways, aren't we? I don't follow that side of things as closely as you do. But again, if you look at those moments in history, recent history, where you cannot understand how the world didn't wake up to the problem, it would probably be when the American president chose to treat as an honest broker somebody who was claiming that the victims of a school massacre were fake, were hoaxes, were actors. I can't even get those words out. And there was a bloke in this country who worked for the same outfit as Alex Jones, who was briefly very, very prominent on social media as a kind of spokesman or champion of the alt-right, under the same banner, flogging brain juice or whatever it was. And he was treated as a serious player for a while, just around the same time that people like Hopkins and Farage were being feted and having red carpets rolled out for them. God, retrospect is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Dan, thank you. I don't know what time it is in New Jersey, but I'm grateful for your input regardless. Francisco is in Cardiff. Francisco, what would you like to say?
Thank you for having me in your show, Mr. O'Brien.
You're very welcome.
I was listening to you, paying careful attention to what you said about confronting and standing against fascists and leaders like Trump, verting lies against its own democracy.
Yes.
And I was thinking, we have a perfect example in Europe of a place where fascism triumphed, and that's Spain. We have fascism for over 40 years, probably the only country that suffered the disease of fascism for so long. The lies and the official history that they managed to create, it hasn't been contested. If we were not to oppose Trump, if America wouldn't be able to get rid of people like Trump, those lies will become the history of the country, like it happened in mine. And if you analyze the Spanish political spectrum at the moment, we are divided. We are in constant territorial crisis because we never came to terms to confront those lies. And in our own parliament, we have a third of the parliament currently, it's openly declared Francoist, fascist. So that's the danger I think we've learned, not only from my own country, from what's going on now at the moment in America, is that we need to confront those lies. Otherwise, the vision will be forever, like it's happening in Spain at the moment.
I don't know enough about Spain to comment on that side of your contribution, and I've got no reason to do so, because you've covered it so completely. But I tell you what you remind me of, this question of unity. The question, and there were moments of glibness in Biden's speech yesterday, because actually maybe that's not fair. Maybe he did answer this question. What is it that we are being called upon to unite behind? So you unite behind objective truth. You unite behind the rule of law. You unite behind democratic institutions. I mean, the last two of which arguably have come under attack from the British government in this country at the moment. But that's why the unity message isn't quite as simplistic as some people might like to believe. You unite behind things that everybody agrees on, and until you agree on objective truth, for example, the election result, for example, whether it was raining on Inauguration Day, to use a trivial example, then you can't unite. So again, we come back to the media, I think, Francisco. If you're going to pay someone to write a column that is essentially not true, or giving a green light to a politician who's saying things that are not true, then the country can never unite.
I think you nailed it there. And that's exactly my point.
Yes.
That was exactly my point. There is no unity. If we, as a society, we don't agree on what's the truth, and the truth has to be not something, it has to be tangible. It has to be, the law is the truth. And if we start doubting about the basics, foundation of our own democracy, there will never be that unity there. And that's something I'm going to take from the recent event.
Yes, and where you compare the last 4 years in America with the last 50 years in Spain, 40 years in Spain, 80 years in Spain.
Yeah.
and inevitably the lens that you look at the world through is a little bit different from mine. But there are fundamental truths at the heart of all these corruptions of democracies, societies and populations. And it's when the truth becomes negotiable. For me, I think 10 years from now, if you stop me in the pub and say, what was the biggest moment for you in all of that mess? And it won't actually be the egregious offences against even the most basic morality, like the caging of children, the splitting up of families, the ban upon people from Middle Eastern countries being able even to come to America, all of the stuff describing Mexicans as rapists, insulting disabled. I think it will be Kellyanne Conway knowing that she was doing the boss's bidding when she talked about alternative facts. And that was very, very early on. That was essentially the Trump White House running a flag up the flagpole that said, the truth is our enemy. And that is, of course, the first stage of any fascistic movement. Francisco, thank you so much. And the lessons of the last 4 years. I'm going to apologise for a degree of predictability. Some of the lessons that I am professing to have learned over the last 4 years are perhaps sermons that I've been preaching to you for the duration. But I think it's so important, of course, as I wrote about in my latest book, to acknowledge when you're wrong about things, but equally, just when you feel things change inside you, that doubling down on the decision you took 20 years ago, talking to Dan in New Jersey about that footballification theory that we talk about a lot on the programme. Why on earth is that person behaving in that way? Because they see their life as a football match. And they have chosen to support. Biden talked yesterday about blue and red, didn't he? He talked about the dangers of... And he said, I am here for you even if you didn't vote for me. Judge me on what I do. I wonder if he's read the book. Even I'm not that conceited. But the point about how the hell those of us who sit here are all baffled about the behaviour of others, and the answer is often, well, look, I'm too busy to dig into the detail. I've picked a side and I'm going to cheer them furiously, right up until the point that a bloke in a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt storms the cradle of American democracy. I mean, what have you learned over the last 4 years? Dan mentioned InfoWars. That was the name of that organisation, and Alex Jones, inviting people like that into the mainstream media. And then, of course, the people that colluded with people like Alex Jones and Steve Bannon, who we talked about yesterday. Red carpets rolled out all over the place for Steve Bannon. I think the word is appeasement, isn't it? Which, until relatively recently, had a correct resonance in the UK. But now you have to respect the office of the German Chancellor in 1937. Really? Well, you have to respect the office of the President of America, even if he is monstrous. So John Bercow probably deserves a retrospective apology from a lot of his own party. Do you? Really? Theresa May held his hand Appeasement is the word, isn't it? So you see something disgusting and you think that standing up to it might damage your own interests more than holding hands with it. And that's where pragmatism overtakes principle. Well, obviously, in an ideal universe, we would be able to describe Donald Trump in exactly the terms that we know him to be. But this is not an ideal universe. So I'm going to go on the telly and claim that he deserves a Nobel Prize, Boris Johnson. Yeah. It's appeasement or it's enthusiasm. Is there anything else? Let's do that. We've got half an hour left before Mystery Hour. There's one phone line free at the moment. Mick and Philip are up next. After them, it could be you. But so I've got, you're either enthusiastic about Donald Trump's fascism, you are either appeasing Donald Trump's fascism for whatever reason, whether national interest if you're a politician or self-interest if you're a journalist, or you were disgusted by it. Ambivalence? I don't know. So in terms of people that went along with it, didn't criticise it, didn't condemn it, never called it out, you're either enthusiastic or you're appeasing. Is there a third way? 0345 606 0973. Dan suggested gullible. He's probably right, actually, isn't he? Is there a fourth way? Mick's in Ipswich. Mick, what's going on?
Yeah, hello, James.
Hello, mate.
The amazing thing is with Trump and also over here is the way that the media, normally owned by billionaires,
yes,
managed to get poor people to vote against their interests. I mean, we have it here with the Daily Mail and Express and all those newspapers. In America...
So the Express, I'm such a pedant, Mick. I do apologise. The Express is now owned by Reach PLC as opposed to an individual billionaire. But that you can use the Sun or the Telegraph instead if you want.
And, I saw a CBS documentary where they went to one of the poorest counties in Kentucky.
Yes.
There's a guy there, an ex-miner with emphysema, all these kind of things. Because of Obamacare, he gets $6,000 worth of drugs a month.
Wow.
And he voted for Trump, who was about to get rid of all that.
He never did, did he? But he tried.
And I think it is, the danger is the media. I mean, for my sins, I have Private Eye. And I read stories in Private Eye every fortnight, and I think, why isn't this in the news? Yeah. And it's just the same as listening, I'm going to blow your trumpet a little bit. Listening to you, I think, why the heck don't we have more people like, why aren't you on Newsnight? Why don't we have a James O'Brien hour once a week?
God forbid. Be careful what you wish for, Mick. I mean, to be clear, because the media you describe tells lots of lies about me, and the biggest perhaps is that I didn't leave Newsnight of my own accord. I left Newsnight, and it was only a sideline. I'm not St. James. My day job was LBC. If the bulk of my income had been the BBC and I was doing LBC at weekends, I might have taken a different decision. I don't know. But I concluded in the middle of an interview with Andrea Leadsom and Pascal Lamy about the WTO, I concluded that I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't pretend that they were equal and opposite contributors to a conversation about the World Trade Organization when Pascal used to run it. And the nicest thing one could say about Andrea Leadsom is that she didn't. So in order to say what I want to say on this radio show, or even to tweet the truth about Donald Trump, I had to leave the BBC. And in normal circumstances, I wouldn't have done. It was just those two issues, Brexit and Trump. But anyway, enough about me. Carry on telling me what you think about me.
But the thing is, it's just simple things. It's like over here, where you get the Sun and the Times, all these Murdoch newspapers banging on about the BBC, how terrible it is, we should do away with the licence fee. But how many people who read these papers realise, oh, hang on, he owns the Sun.
I know.
And he would love nothing more than for BBC to disappear.
Oh, and he's setting up a new right-wing talk show, the bloke who set up Fox in America. I mean, I'm like you, actually. I read some of that stuff and elsewhere, and I do think... But the answer is really simple, as you know, Mick, but for people listening who may not have kept up, it's really... Why the hell would you want to own a newspaper if you were a tax-avoiding billionaire? Answer, to represent the interests of tax-avoiding billionaires. There's only so many think tanks you can set up and contribute to. Eventually, you're going to have to own an organ in the mainstream media. So if you, as a tax-avoiding billionaire who's registered offshore or who is an American citizen, do you own newspapers and television stations in order to represent the interests of ordinary working-class voters, or do you own a television station and a newspaper to represent the interests of non-domiciled or foreign citizen billionaire owners of newspapers and television. I mean, it's so blinking obvious, but as you know as well as I do, the BBC's next, Mick.
Yeah.
And I
can see it going.
You could dip into Twitter now and find a bunch of people absolutely convinced that the BBC is their enemy. Why? Well, because the people that own the newspapers have told them that the BBC is their enemy, and also something statues, something. There was a really interesting moment on Sky News yesterday, which incidentally isn't owned by Rupert Murdoch anymore, but and employs some brilliant journalists, some absolutely brilliant journalists. And Sam Coates, who's a relatively recent arrival there, asked Boris Johnson a brilliant question that I think cuts to the heart of the next chapter in British politics more than American politics. It was a question that he asked Boris Johnson about Joe Biden. And if you've wondered why I wang on sometimes about people complaining about dance troupes on TV talent shows and complaining about the absence of audience sing-alongs at events that don't have an audience, or people who seem to care more about statues of long-dead slavers than they do of hungry school children in their own postcode, then the question that Sam Coates asked Boris Johnson yesterday cut to the very heart of it. And his answer, I wish I could show you his face on the radio, but his answer in many ways said it all. And I shall share that little clip with you after the very latest headlines with Holly Harris. Is there anything else to explain, if you were to talk about the media perhaps rather than the ordinary punter? Either you were enthusiastic about Donald Trump, you were an appeaser of Donald Trump, or you were a harsh critic of Donald Trump. I don't think there were any other paths, and I don't think anyone would argue now, as the Pontius Pilate hand-washing exercise gathers pace at an astonishing speed. I don't think anybody would argue now that the enthusiasm was defensible. For me, appeasing certainly wasn't defensible either, but I'm just a gob on a stick. I'm not, as you know, a politician at this point in my life. There was so much there in Biden's speech that felt like, I don't want to say validation or vindication, but maybe those are the only words that fit. As I explained, if you're just tuning in, I realised while Biden was speaking that there have been many times over the last 4 years where I think I even tried to persuade myself that what we could see wasn't fascism. And of course, the number of voices that started screaming at us the minute we used the F word perhaps added to the temptation to persuade yourself that that wasn't what you could see. But now, my goodness me, now the scales have fallen from the eyes, and the Pontius Pilates of British politics and media are competing to see who can scrub their hands the hardest. There's no other word to describe it, is there? So a couple more points. Actually, just have a listen to this. This is Sam Coates of Sky News putting what is, I think, a superb question to Boris Johnson. And it might sound at first glance a little bit glib and even, dare I say, tabloidy. But this is a question built upon a deep understanding of the current political landscape and the seismic shift in relations between an American regime led by Donald Trump and American administration led by Joe Biden.
As some senior politicians in Britain seem to, that President Biden is woke.
I can't comment on that. But what I know is that he's a fervent believer in the transatlantic alliance, and that's a great thing, and a believer in a lot of the things that we want to achieve together. And insofar as nothing wrong being woke, but what I can tell you is that I think that it's very, very important for everybody and certainly I will put myself in the category of people who believe that it's important to stick up for your history, your traditions and your values and things you believe in.
But you see, the problem, as Johnson knows, and there's a reason why he is probably the first politician in history to sound even more like his spitting image puppet than his spitting image puppet. But when he talks, sticking up for your history, well, what if elements of your history were reprehensible? How are you going to stick up for them? Answer, get Robert Jenrick to write an article for the Sunday Telegraph about how important it is to stick up for statues. Bizarre, really. The reason why Boris Johnson, at this point in his premiership, can't say, well, of course Joe Biden is woke, and that's one of the many reasons I love him, is because woke essentially means this.
I know, speaking of unity, can sound to some like a foolish fantasy these days. I know the forces that divide us are deep and they are real, but I also know they are not new. Our history has been a constant struggle between the American ideal that we're all are created equal and the harsh, ugly reality that racism, nativism, fear, demonization have long torn us apart. The battle is perennial, and victory is never assured.
That's woke, you see. Lifting the ban on transgender people in the American military, which I think he's already done, that's woke, you see. Calling out white supremacism, as he did in that inauguration speech, that is woke, you see. Warning against the attack on truth. Shall we have another listen to that? Because this is woke. This is woke as well.
We face an attack on our democracy and on truth. A raging virus, growing inequity, the sting of systemic racism, a climate in crisis, America's role in the world. Any one of these would be enough to challenge us in profound ways. But the fact is, we face them all at once, presenting this nation with one of the gravest responsibilities we've had. Now we're going to be tested. Are we going to step up?
That's woke, you see. That's why Boris Johnson can't answer the question about whether Joe Biden is woke, because his government is built upon the polar opposite of what Joe Biden is describing. Oh, and this is woke as well.
Democracy is fragile. And at this hour, my friends, democracy has prevailed. So now, on this hallowed ground where just a few days ago, violence sought to shake the Capitol's very foundation, we come together as one nation, under God, indivisible, to carry out the peaceful transfer of power as we have for more than 2 centuries. As we look ahead and our...
So that's all woke. So now you've heard that, the attack upon racism, the attack upon lies, the attacks upon truth. Now listen again to Boris Johnson answering the question about whether he thinks Joe Biden is woke, and understand completely why he falls apart so spectacularly. I'm going to use that line again. I'm quite pleased with it. They're probably the only politician in history that sounds more like his spitting image puppet than his spitting image puppet does.
As some senior politicians in Britain seem to, that President Biden is woke.
I can't comment on that. But what I know is that he's a fervent believer in the transatlantic alliance, and that's a great thing, and a believer in a lot of the things that we want to achieve together. And insofar as nothing wrong being woke, but what I can tell you is that I think that it's very, very important for everybody and certainly I will put myself in the category of people who believe that it's important to stick up for your history, your traditions, and your values and things you believe in.
I mean, it would be funny if he wasn't actually in charge of our entire country. Very important to stick up for your history. Well, all of it. Yeah, all of it. Especially the slavery. Oh, okay, as you were. Also, down with dance troops. 11:41 is the time. Graham is in Totnes in Devon. Graham, what have you learned from the last 4 years?
Well, what I've learned from Trump in his time as president is that the principle of free speech is tricky in a world of social media.
That's for sure.
Social media amplifies free speech in a way that could never really have been predicted. And it's a bit like the right to bear arms was nice and simple when people had relatively small guns, and now they wander around with Kalashnikovs. And I'm a bit concerned about this because the question's being raised, is Trump about to set up his own social media company?
Where they wouldn't... I mean, Twitter has not had, I don't think, a great 4 years. I mean, better late than never is a comforting thought, but it's not a... and they've finally taken action against, I think, the Chinese embassy in America for lying on the platform as well. But I mean, for me, freedom of speech has always been about consequences. I think you're singing from the same hymn sheet. It's all very well talking about freedom of speech, but what these people want is to be able to talk nonsense. There's a reason why a lot of people who cast themselves as freedom of speech warriors have been the most dangerous nonsense spouters regarding coronavirus and lockdowns. That's not a coincidence. They want to be able to say whatever they want, unchallenged, and social media kind of lets them, doesn't it?
It does, especially as people are allowed to post things anonymously. I mean, I think if we had a rule that you've got to give your own name, then anybody who spouts stuff on social media would be as accountable as you are for your programme.
Yes, but would that make much difference, do you think? I mean, how many people, the terminology is usually troll, isn't it? How many trolls would disappear if they had to put their own name on there? I mean, at the beginning of Trump's presidency, arguably almost all of them would, but by the end, people were prepared to, record films of themselves talking about how they were going to attack the Capitol. So, chicken and egg, maybe, is it?
Well, there's a difference between what might be necessary and what might be sufficient. I just think part of the problem we've got is that over a period of time, we've seen a series of changes that have taken place. Nobody's ever thought about where it might end and what we might need to do in order to make the world a safer place for people. And for some reason or other, perhaps we got rather antiquated processes. We just never seem to get ahead of the technology, and I think it's a bit of a warning sign for the whole of the world, frankly, that we seem to be able to develop technology and what we can do much quicker than whether we ever decide whether it's what we ought to do. It's what I remember Johnny Morris talking about. The difference between, yes, you can do it, but is it wise? And if there is an enthusiasm at the moment, partly through your priceless radio programme and as well as the President of the United States, is that perhaps there might be a bit of sharing of wisdom around the place. And not just can we do it, but is it wise to do?
Should we do it?
Yeah.
We can do it, doesn't mean that we should do it. I don't know if I share your pessimism about social media, or rather your... giving it the sort of game-changing status. I guess that it is the gathering point, isn't it? Because I don't do much. I'm only really on Twitter. But the idea that when you look at some of the QAnon chat rooms yesterday that were slowly waking up to the fact that there wasn't going to be a kind of revolution. Donald Trump wasn't going to march onto the inauguration stage with his newly instituted body of laws and military personnel. And watching that fall apart, you find yourself wondering, how could they ever have believed it was going to happen? And the answer is social media. And then, the way that lies can be spread. And there's not a great deal you can do when people tell lies about you. I have one of the particularly nasty sites claiming that my book was a flop. When I think it was just past the 200, my last book, just past the 200,000 sales mark. So that's a trivial example of something that if it wasn't for social media, I can talk about it because it's a lie about me. If it wasn't for social media, that would just be someone shouting at clouds in the park, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's the point. We have to go back and think, when did these principles begin?
Yes.
And you might have had 500 people in a hall somewhere being spoken to, and that's not the world that we're in now, any more than the Kalashnikov is at all like the very simple revolver that somebody might have had to protect themselves.
I love that parallel. I do. I mean, it might not stand up to further scrutiny, but for now, Graham, I'm nicking it off you. The idea that freedom of speech legislation in a world with social media is the same as it should have been in a world with quills and carrier pigeons, versus the idea that the right to bear arms is the same in a world where any sort of hick with a driving licence can get an automatic weapon, is the same as it was where it took you 2 minutes to load your musket. I like that a lot. And speaking of suffering, I have to issue an apology to Mike Graham. Mike's got in touch to say, as a skilled reenactor in the sealed knot, I can reload my musket in 30 seconds, James. And that's from Mike, who's in Chester. So I apologise for suggesting that it might take you 2 minutes to load your musket. Do you know, Mike, I don't want to say as I get older, but as I get older, I find the world of military reenactment ever more fascinating. Taken up geocaching recently. I mean, it's better than having an affair with your secretary and buying a Lamborghini, isn't it? If your middle life crisis stretches to geocaching and military reenactments, I suspect that the overall picture is a much prettier one than it could have been. But I've always fancied that. I did it years ago because I grew up in Worcestershire, so Civil War reenactments were quite popular when I was at prep school, and we used to go to a couple. But we were at prep school, so we just used to use the opportunity to try and sneak cider down our necks and eat food that hadn't come from the school kitchens, which largely rendered it edible. But yes, all right, 30 seconds to load your musket. I think the point still stands. How many bullets can an automatic rifle discharge in 30 seconds? And the right to bear arms was created when Mike's musket skills were front and centre. Now, you could probably buy a rocket launcher in Walmart. It's a figure of speech, actually, I hope. 11:51 is the time. Back to the lessons we have learned from the last 4 years. Or, of course, the biggest lesson we've learned is that people loved it. And they probably still do. They'll go quiet for a while, but they will still cling to the idea that because they were born in a certain place or with a certain skin colour or at a certain time, then they are better than you. And if they end up owning a newspaper or a television station, then they'll end up persuading you to punch yourself in the face in the ballot box every 4 years. That's just how it works. It's not even an opinion anymore. It's just a historical fact. Paul's in Croydon. Paul, what would you like to say?
James,
Paul.
Happy belated New Year's, mate.
Oh, thank you. Crikey, that is belated. I'm very well indeed. I've had a birthday since then, if we're going to get technical about it.
Oh, happy birthday.
That's all right. Carry on. Fill your boots.
What I've learned in the last 4 years is Trump has shown outwardly what I've always noticed, but I hope that most people have noticed now, that American politics, especially in politics in general, is very dark, is very nefarious, and he was very outwardly with it. I think it started with, obviously, when Hillary had her debates with him.
Yes.
He had no public record, he had no political record, so she had to go for his, horrible character.
Yes.
And that stuck. And now we can bring in footballification,
yes.
which I believe in. Well, I think it's a great phrase. And I'm a football fan, so I've been analysing this when there's been no football. I've enjoyed the sort of cultural and political shenanigans going on, and I can see that CNN, going to stay with America, CNN and Fox News, they're so partisan. They love to over-report or under-report. They stoke things up. By the way, I'm anti-Trump.
No, I appreciate that. I don't know enough. I've got to be honest with you, because I mean, obviously, one sees clips of Fox News. When you say partisan in the context of CNN, what are you saying that I wouldn't just file under anti-racist?
Very, very, very justified anger with George Floyd. Riots ensued. Read any sociological book. That's a normal human emotion.
Yes.
But it was kind of downplayed a lot. To one point, Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo, who I do like, were like, oh, show me a riot that's not angry. But at the same time, only local news would report that a lot of black businesses were being smashed up. Do you know what I mean? So
no, I don't. I honestly don't. And I'm not being obtuse, but so how would you have rather it was reported?
We, if I can say, me personally, centre-left,
right,
left-wing, liberal, should always have the moral high ground. I might be naive, but I think we should try.
Yes.
And that way we will never have any sort of vacuums where misinformation can come in, because for example, going back to Hillary, she had to go for his Trump's.
I just want to be clear.
character.
I'm not badgering the witness. So you think that CNN downplayed some of the violence on Black Lives Matter protests?
I think personally, they
Fine.
literally did.
No, I understand, because and again, I'm not qualified to make full fat comparisons, but I was profoundly uncomfortable. We saw it reflected here as well. Protesting about the murder of an innocent man of colour by a uniformed police officer, to me, is not the same as protesting against anti-racism. I mean, the London example was pretty clear. We had Black Lives Matter protests. Tragically, they occurred during the virus. Happily, we now know that being outdoors is probably the best guard you can have against infection, but we categorically didn't know that at the time. So we had, if memory serves, 2 weekends or 2 weeks of protests, or one massive protest by under the Black Lives Matter banner, and then we had protests by racists. And
exactly.
To me, they shouldn't be reported equally.
But then you've got, in America, you've got guys who... something didn't happen in Seattle where they took over 6 blocks of a city. The police didn't want to engage. Black Democrats went down there and said, guys, please, this is not good. This is not our message. And they were booed off the mic.
But that's the point that I thought I was making, is that those protesters at the extremes were not representative of a larger body, whereas the protesters that stormed the Capitol and the racists and the white supremacists, they were representative of the man in the White House.
But here comes footballification, because Fox News will over-report the 200 people who arrived.
And you think CNN pushes back in the opposite direction? Okay, no, that stands. I mean, from what I've seen of them, I think they're pretty neutral, and it's only the current climate that makes them look biased. In the same way people accuse the BBC of being biased, because every other news outlet they encounter is so slavishly right-wing that it makes the middle look left-wing. But we'll have a conversation about that another day.
Yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, and that is possibly part of the problem or part of the solution. I'm not sure. I don't see any news outlets in this country passionately opposing Brexit and or the Conservative government. I see the BBC being balanced and then the rest of the media being sycophantic and slavishly supportive. And then there's sort of little old me over here, stuck in the middle with you. John's in Carnarvon in Wales. John, what would you like to say?
Well, I think what I've learned over the last 4 years, James, is meritocracy has breeded a huge amount of resent in the working classes. You know, basically the logic is it's your fault you're poor. It's, because you're not good enough.
False meritocracy, isn't it? It's false meritocracy.
Yeah. And people internalise that, and it, leads to self-hate. And what Trump did is he came along and he found these various groups, suffering from this sort of resentiment, as Nietzsche would say, and he redirected that cruelty to China or to immigrants or to, the Hollywood liberal elite and said, it's their fault.
It's their fault.
It's their fault. You don't have to hate yourselves anymore, guys.
Or your life.
What everybody's missed in the centre and the left, here and in America, is nobody's pointed out that actually, if you're successful, it's luck and circumstance. Same as if you're not successful. You don't need to blame yourselves. You don't need to look up to the rich.
No, you can blame the system, I think. This is why I said false meritocracy. I mean, schools like mine, there's no earthly way I'd be doing this for a living or enjoying the lifestyle that I enjoy if I hadn't gone to the school that I went to. Maybe I would have done, but I'd be freakish if I had done, rather than relatively normal for the background that my parents bought me.
But you can't even begin to have that conversation with people that believe and have internalised the noble lie of meritocracy. Once people start to realise, it's not actually my fault that I'm poor, and it's not that due to his virtue that him over there is rich.
Right.
You can have those conversations about systemic change and,
so there's two sides of deference. There's the recipient and there is the giver. So, one thinks of people who were born on third base and think they've scored a home run, and Donald Trump's children inevitably hove into view on that side of the Atlantic. Over here, I always imagine how Jacob Rees-Mogg would have gone on in life if he'd been born on a council estate in Liverpool. And yet the people who hang upon Jacob Rees-Mogg's every word, even as he hangs out with Steve Bannon and suggests that he'd vote for the white supremacist Donald Trump, they think by dint of his accent and his upbringing, he's actually better than them. And that's got nothing to do with race.
No, it's not. It's hubris on the one side and resentment and self-loathing on the other side. And, all it took was somebody to come along and say, oh, actually, I can take all of this rage and I can move it to where it suits me.
And Trump understood that. He understood that in a way that is almost in his bones, in his blood, as opposed to in his brain. Because when he said the thing about Fifth Avenue, to which often these conversations return, he knew exactly not just what he was talking about, but who he was talking about. If I pressed the right buttons, then I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and you'd still love me. I wonder when we'll talk about Donald Trump next. Be nice to think never.
You rotten bastards. I don't know if you're gay or straight, and personally I don't care. You just keep making fun of everything. That I'm aware. You rotten bastards should be sent to hell. You'll get your